In the spring of 1943, deep in the frigid expanse of the North Atlantic, a silent war threatened the very lifeline of the Allied world. Every day, German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, hunting merchant convoys that carried food, fuel, ammunition, and soldiers across the ocean. The Battle of the Atlantic had already raged for years, and the stakes had never been higher. Each time a convoy slipped out of Halifax or New York, its captains knew they were entering a vast, deadly battlefield, one where a single torpedo could doom a ship and all aboard it. The enemy was invisible, patient, and merciless. By May 1943, the situation had reached a breaking point. Allied shipping losses were devastating, and the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, emboldened by success, spread across the Atlantic like a pack of wolves. Convoy escorts fought bravely, but many times help arrived too late. Aircraft patrols were too high, too slow to react, or too limited by weather and range. The Navy desperately needed a breakthrough, a new tactic, a new idea. Someone willing to risk everything to change the direction of a failing campaign. That someone was Lieutenant Commander William "Bill" Drain, a tough, experienced naval aviator and commander of a TBF Avenger squadron aboard an escort carrier. His pilots faced the harshest flying conditions imaginable: towering waves, unpredictable storms, icy winds, and constant mechanical strain on their aircraft. Yet, despite all these hardships, Drain believed that aircraft, not ships, held the key to defeating the U-boat menace. Drain began studying U-boat behavior, attack patterns, and surfacing habits. He realized something crucial. Submarines were most vulnerable right when they surfaced to recharge their batteries, but catching them at that exact moment required an attack approach far more aggressive than standard doctrine allowed. Traditional bombing runs were too slow and too high, giving U-boat crews precious seconds to crash dive to safety. So Drain proposed a bold, almost reckless idea: low-altitude dive bombing with depth charges. Instead of releasing bombs from hundreds or thousands of feet, his Avengers would roar in at just 100 feet above the ocean, diving hard, fast, and dangerously close to the water's surface. This approach would give U-boats almost no time to react. If the bombs hit water near the hull before the submarine could submerge, the pressure wave alone could tear the steel vessel apart. Many considered the tactic absurd, even suicidal. Flying so low over the Atlantic in combat conditions was already perilous. Doing it in unstable weather, under fire while dropping live explosives, it seemed impossible. But Drain believed that American naval aviators were capable of more than the manuals gave them credit for. He knew that his pilots, if properly trained and motivated, could master this new style of attack. And so the squadron began practicing. They flew just above the waves, learning to read the wind, feel the aircraft's behavior, and time their dives perfectly. They studied the glint of a periscope, the flash of a conning tower, the telltale white wake of a U-boat surfacing. They rehearsed coordination with convoy ships, communicating precise patrol patterns across vast stretches of ocean. They trained to attack without hesitation, without fear, and without giving the enemy even a heartbeat of opportunity. When the first real contact came, everything Drain envisioned became reality. An Avenger spotted a U-boat breaking the surface in the early morning fog. Without waiting for backup, The pilot dove hard, the aircraft shaking violently in the cold air. Depth charges tumbled into the water, exploding just yards from the submarine. The blast lifted the U-boat out of the ocean before it disappeared beneath the waves forever. The tactic had worked. It was fast, it was deadly, and it was revolutionary. Word spread quickly across the Atlantic fleet. Escort carriers adopted Drain's method. Pilots embraced the new aggression, transforming from patrol observers into precision hunters. More U-boats were sunk in the following weeks than in any previous period of the war. The German fleet, once unstoppable, found itself overwhelmed by relentless aircraft that seemed to strike from nowhere. By the summer of 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively. Convoys became safer. U-boats went from hunters to hunted. And Drain's daring innovation, low-altitude anti-submarine dive bombing, became a core element of naval aviation doctrine for years to come. This is the story of courage, imagination, and the unbreakable resolve of the U.S. Navy pilots who flew through storms, gunfire, and fear itself to protect the convoys below. This is the moment when a simple idea, forged in the harshest theater of war, changed history and helped secure victory for the free world. In the vast steel-gray wilderness of the North Atlantic, where the waves towered like mountains and the winds carved icy scars across the sky, a new breed of aviator rose to meet one of World War II's greatest challenges. They were young, determined, and untested. Pilots of the U.S. Navy's TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Men who would soon become the unexpected heroes of a brutal, invisible war fought above the endless sea. By early 1943, Allied commanders were running out of time. Convoy after convoy was being ripped apart by German U-boats. These submarines, sleek and deadly, moved silently beneath the surface, surfacing only long enough to recharge batteries and unleash their torpedoes before vanishing again beneath the waves. Ships carrying food, oil, ammunition, and troops disappeared overnight. Lives, families, and futures were swallowed by the cold Atlantic. The ocean had become a graveyard, and the U-boats ruled it with chilling efficiency. Against this shadowy threat, the escort carriers emerged as fragile but vital guardians. Small, lightly armored, and constantly battered by storms, these carriers served as the airborne shield of the convoys. Their flight decks were short, their aircraft were few, their pilots had no room for error. Yet from this unlikely environment came a transformation that would rewrite the fate of the war. The Avenger squadrons assigned to escort carriers were not pampered or privileged. They faced exhausting conditions, impossible weather, brutal schedules, maintenance nightmares, and the constant knowledge that one mistake meant death. But they were innovators by necessity, and it was in these dangerous, unpredictable skies that a new approach to anti-submarine warfare took form. Each pilot learned to live on alert. They studied the ocean as if it were a living, breathing opponent. They memorized the behavior of U-boats, how long they stayed submerged, how quickly they crash-dived, the shape of their wakes, the angle of their conning towers. They trained in storms so violent that raindrops felt like bullets against the canopy. They learned to fly low enough that the spray from the waves slapped the underside of the Avenger's wings. Aggressive flying style demanded more than skill, it required nerve. Flying at 100 feet over the roaring sea was nothing short of terrifying. One sudden downdraft, one unexpected swell, and a pilot could find himself plunging straight into the Atlantic. Yet these aviators embraced the danger, knowing that it was the only way to catch a U-boat before it disappeared beneath the waves. The turning point came in the spring of 1943. A squadron flying Avengers spotted a U-boat surfacing near a convoy, most likely preparing to attack under cover of fog. Within seconds, a pilot rolled into a dive so steep that the ocean rushed upward like a wall of black water. The Avenger swooped down, engines howling, wind tearing at the fuselage. Depth charges tumbled into the sea. The detonations threw massive columns of water skyward, and when the spray cleared, the U-boat was gone, destroyed before it could escape. News of such victories electrified the Atlantic fleet. Suddenly, this small band of escort carrier pilots became the spearhead of the Allied counterattack. Their tactics spread rapidly, reshaping the entire strategy of anti-submarine warfare. Other squadrons adopted drain-style low-altitude runs. Radar and sonar improved. Communication between ships and aircraft tightened. The sky, once merely a place for patrols, became a battlefield where the U-boats could no longer hide. Day after day, Avenger pilots launched from their carriers, regardless of the weather. They flew into fog banks that swallowed their aircraft whole. They endured freezing cockpit temperatures, engine failures, and constant radio static. They searched for periscope wakes, oil slicks, or even the faintest shadow beneath the waves. Many missions ended with nothing but empty ocean and exhaustion. Others ended in dramatic strikes that sent entire U-boat crews to the depths. These were not glamorous battles. There were no cheering crowds, no newsreel glory, no medals pinned in front of cameras. The war at sea was quiet, deadly, and largely unseen. But the pilots knew the importance of every mission, every patrol, and every hour spent scanning the waters. Every submarine stopped meant convoys saved. Every convoy saved meant factories supplied, armies fed, and nations kept alive. By the summer of 1943, the effect was undeniable. U-boat losses mounted. Convoys grew safer. Ship sinkings dropped dramatically. The German submarine force, once confident and dominant, found itself outnumbered, outmatched, and overwhelmed. The hunters had become the hunted, and much of that shift could be traced to the relentless persistence, creativity, and courage of the Avenger crews. These pilots didn't just change tactics, they changed the direction of the entire war in the Atlantic. They helped restore the balance in a campaign that had nearly doomed the Allied cause. Their victories, often claimed in isolation over miles of empty ocean, played a central role in securing the supply lines that fueled the liberation of Europe. This is their legacy, a legacy of ingenuity, bravery, and relentless determination. A legacy forged in freezing winds, crashing waves, and the roar of radial engines, and a legacy that turned the tide of one of World War II's most critical battles. Far from the headlines and far from the crowds that filled the cities of America, a quiet and deadly war unfolded across millions of square miles of open ocean. It was a war with no front lines, no trenches, and no visible enemy. Only silence, suspense, and the endless rhythm of the waves. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, and at its heart stood a group of unlikely heroes, the pilots of the U.S. Navy escort carriers. These carriers were not the powerful fleet giants that captured public imagination. They were compact, lightly armored, and constantly tossed around by the winter gales of the North Atlantic. Their flight decks were so short that one wrong gust of wind could throw a launching aircraft into the sea. Yet these ships became the backbone of Allied strategy, carrying Avengers that proved decisive against the German U-boat threat. Life aboard an escort carrier was harsh and unforgiving. Pilots slept in cramped quarters, while engines roared through thin walls. The smell of oil, salt water, and exhaust filled the air. Every launch felt like a gamble. Every landing felt like a miracle. But these squadrons adapted quickly, forging a bond that grew stronger with each mission. What made these crews so effective was not superior equipment. It was the human spirit. It was the willingness to innovate under pressure and to take risks that doctrine had never considered. When traditional anti-submarine tactics failed, these pilots created new ones. They became weather experts, ocean watchers, and masters of low-altitude flight. They learned to distinguish natural wave patterns from the wake of a periscope. They trained themselves to see in fog, to listen through static, and to fight through fear. A typical patrol began before dawn, when the ocean was still dark and the horizon barely visible. Mechanics worked by flashlight to ready the Avengers. Pilots strapped into freezing cockpits, breath fogging inside their masks. As engines roared to life, the entire deck shook, and then, with a final wave from the deck crew, the aircraft leapt forward, climbing into the storm-colored sky. Once airborne, the pilots entered a world of isolation. Radio contact was often weak. Storms were constant. Clouds hid the ocean for hours at a time. But when the weather cleared, when the gray veil lifted even for a moment, the hunt began. Spotting a U-boat was part science, part instinct. An oil trail hinted at a damaged vessel. A circular ripple might betray a periscope. A sudden shadow below the surface could mean a submarine running shallow. The pilots studied every detail, every flicker of movement, every change in the sea. When a U-boat surfaced, the reaction had to be instant. The pilot banked sharply, pulling the Avenger into a steep descent. The aircraft vibrated violently as it sliced through the dense Atlantic air. The ocean surged upward. Depth charges armed. The crew shouted coordinates. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for error. At barely 100 feet above the waves, the pilot released the bombs. A moment later, the explosions erupted, sending towering plumes of water skyward. Victory was never celebrated. There was no cheering, only a silent understanding that one more threat had been eliminated. One more convoy could pass safely. One more day had been bought in a war that depended on those supply lines. By the end of 1943, the impact of these aircrews was unmistakable. U-boats sank faster than Germany could replace them. Supply routes strengthened. The Allies prepared for major offensives across Europe. The unseen war in the Atlantic, once a desperate struggle, had turned into a path toward victory. These pilots were hunters, innovators, and protectors. Their courage was not loud or glorious. It was quiet, steady, and relentless. They faced the cold, the storms, the enemy, and the ocean itself. And in doing so, they reshaped the future of naval warfare. Their story remains one of the most profound, yet least celebrated triumphs of World War II. But without them, the tide of war might never have turned. In the cold, unforgiving theater of the North Atlantic, where the horizon blended into a gray line of storms and the sea churned with relentless fury, a new chapter in naval warfare quietly unfolded. It was a chapter shaped not by massive fleets or legendary admirals, but by small escort carriers, their decks slick with salt spray, and by the pilots who launched from them into a world of cloud, darkness, and danger. These were the men of America's airborne submarine hunters, innovators whose courage and creativity reshaped the struggle for control of the Atlantic. At the beginning of 1943, victory seemed far from certain. German U-boats roamed the Atlantic with unnerving confidence, sinking merchant ships at a rate the Allies could scarcely replace. Convoys carrying vital supplies, bread, oil, ammunition, steel, disappeared beneath the waves, often without warning. Entire crews vanished, swallowed by the icy depths. The sea became a vast battleground where no one could see the enemy until it was too late. To counter the U-boat threat, the United States turned increasingly to escort carriers, small, often hastily converted ships that were never intended to be front-line war machines. Their flight decks were short, their speed limited, and their defensive armament minimal. Yet they carried something Germany had not anticipated: aircraft capable not only of spotting submarines from the sky, but of hunting them down with a precision and aggression that defied conventional doctrine. The workhorse of this new airborne force was the TBF Avenger, a rugged torpedo bomber with long wings, a deep fuselage, and a crew of 3 who depended on one another for survival. Inside its metal skin, pilots and gunners endured freezing temperatures, bone-rattling turbulence, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. But they also carried something far more dangerous: depth charges and the willingness to fly low enough to place them exactly where they were needed. The shift toward low-altitude anti-submarine warfare did not happen overnight. It grew quietly, out of observation, frustration, and necessity. Pilots learned through experience that attacking from high altitude simply gave U-boats too much time to escape. These submarines could dive in seconds, disappearing beneath a layer of water thick enough to scatter bombs harmlessly. The answer seemed simple in theory: attack faster, attack lower, attack before the enemy even understood what was happening. But flying low over the storm-thrashed Atlantic was like dancing on a knife's edge. Even at 200 feet, the ocean's surface could suddenly rise on a wave, threatening to slam into the aircraft. At 100 feet, the margin for error measured not in seconds, but in heartbeats. Aviators had to read the texture of the sea, anticipate the wind shifts, and feel the aircraft's behavior as if it were an extension of their own body. And they had to do it all while hunting one of the deadliest predators of the war. Every mission began with tension. The squadron gathered in a cramped ready room, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the low rumble of the carrier's engines. Maps of convoy routes, submarine sightings, and weather systems lined the walls. Briefings were short, direct, and serious. Pilots memorized search patterns, estimated U-boat escape routes, and reviewed signals to communicate with escort ships. They knew that the slightest mistake, one misread instrument, one delayed decision, could mean disaster. When the deck crew signaled for takeoff, each Avenger lurched forward, gaining speed quickly on the short deck. Wind blasted across the bow. Pilots held their breath as the wheels left the wooden planks. For a brief, terrifying moment, the aircraft hung in the air like a stone, unsure whether to fall. Then the wings caught the wind, and the Avenger climbed into the gray sky. Once airborne, the world transformed into a vast expanse of shifting cloud layers. invisible currents, and endless sea. The pilots flew patrol patterns that stretched across hundreds of miles, scanning the water below for any sign of the enemy. A change in color, a line of bubbles, a metallic glint, a ripple where no ripple should be. The hunt was made not of dramatic chases, but of patience. Endless, razor-sharp patience. When a U-boat was finally spotted, often surfacing unexpectedly to recharge batteries, the calm of the patrol shattered instantly. The Avenger banked sharply, dropping into a dive so steep the crew felt the weight of gravity crushing them into their seats. The water expanded in the windshield until it seemed inches away. The pilot adjusted power, corrected for wind, and aimed the aircraft with deadly precision. At the perfect moment, depth charges released, tumbling into the sea. Seconds later, the explosions sent towering columns of water into the air, and the U-boat, once a shadow on the waves, slipped beneath the surface, broken, silenced, defeated. These victories did not come easily. Many aircraft returned with bullet holes, broken instruments, or empty fuel tanks. Some did not return at all, lost to weather, engine failure, or enemy fire. The pilots who survived did not speak of heroism. They spoke of duty, of protecting the convoys, of ensuring that the ships behind them, ships carrying the materials of freedom, reached their destinations. By mid-1943, the impact of these hunters was unmistakable. U-boat commanders grew cautious, even fearful. The ocean sky, once a place of safety, had become a threat. The Atlantic battlefield shifted. Convoys arrived more often. Sinkings decreased. The tide turned not through grand strategy alone, but through countless moments of bravery and innovation. Moments created by the men who flew low, risked everything, and conquered the shadows on the water. Their legacy endures in every naval aviator who searches the seas today. And their story remains a testament to the power of courage, instinct, and the relentless drive to adapt in the face of overwhelming danger. Some text. End of quote. Powerful. Here the interments end. Ending.